For 15 long years, a black rancher named Elijah Booker lived alone on the edge of the New Mexico frontier. His ranch, once buzzing with cattle and laughter, had turned into a ghost of its former self. People said he was hiding from something. Others whispered he had lost everything in a fire. But no one really knew, because no one had visited Elijah in over a decade. He didn't go into town, didn't write letters, and didn't speak to anyone beyond the occasional postman. Then, one cold evening, as the sun dipped low and the wind carried dust across the plains, there was a knock at his door. A woman's voice, soft but firm, asked to be let in. She said she was a nun, and she needed shelter for the night. Elijah stood silent behind the door for a long time, his hand resting on the old revolver by his hip. He hadn't heard a woman's voice in so many years it almost felt unreal. Through the slit in the wood, he could see a figure dressed in black and white, her head bowed, her hands clutching a worn leather bag. "Please," she repeated. "I don't need much. Just a place to sleep before sunrise." Elijah hesitated. Trust didn't come easy to a man like him anymore. But something in her tone reminded him of the past, of Sundays, of hymns, of his mother's voice. With a grunt, he slid the latch and opened the door. The nun stepped in, her eyes scanning the dusty room filled with relics from a forgotten life. Elijah said nothing. He pointed to the wooden bench near the fireplace, and she nodded, sitting down with a heavy sigh. "My name is Sister Agnes," she said, her voice barely louder than the fire's crackle. "Thank you for letting me in." Elijah nodded but didn't offer his name. He moved to the kitchen, poured her a tin cup of lukewarm coffee, and returned without a word. The silence between them was thick, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that understood pain. Sister Agnes didn't ask questions that night. She simply drank her coffee, warmed her hands by the fire, and watched the flames dance. Elijah, meanwhile, studied her from the shadows. She didn't seem afraid of him, and that alone unsettled him. Most strangers who crossed his land turned around as soon as they saw his silhouette. But she had come closer, knocked, waited, and now she was here, without flinching. When she finally fell asleep sitting upright, Elijah sat back in his old rocking chair, the creak of the wood echoing like a ghostly lullaby. Something about her presence stirred memories he had long buried. The next morning, Elijah rose early and started the fire again. The nun was already awake, sitting quietly with her rosary in hand. "You didn't sleep much," he said gruffly, surprising himself with the sound of his own voice. She smiled faintly and replied, "Habit of the road." He looked away, pouring more coffee, unsure what to say next. That's when she asked, "Why did you let me in?" Elijah froze. The question hit harder than it should have. He could have said it was pity or guilt, or that it was the Christian thing to do. But the truth was, he didn't know. "You looked like someone who needed help," he finally answered. That morning, she asked if she could stay a little longer. Just one more night. Elijah wasn't sure why he agreed. Maybe it was the way she asked, calm and without pressure. Or maybe it was because, deep down, he didn't want to go back to the silence. Days turned into 2, then 3. Sister Agnes didn't pry into his past. Instead, she helped clean, cooked simple meals, and even mended the torn curtain by the window. Each evening, she sat by the fire and read softly from a worn Bible, not preaching, just sharing. And every night, Elijah found himself listening. By the 5th night, Elijah began to speak. Not much, but enough. He told her about the ranch, how it used to be his father's, how he had taken it over after the war, how the town turned its back on him after a false accusation drove his wife away and his friends disappeared. He told her about the long nights, the empty birthdays, the dust storms that felt like punishment. Sister Agnes listened without interruption. She didn't offer forgiveness. She didn't say, "God has a plan." She just listened, and that was something Elijah hadn't had in a long, long time. In the following days, she shared her own story. She was on her way to a mission near the Mexican border. Her church had been burned down by bandits, and she was the only one who survived. She had walked for days through the desert, relying on strangers and God. "And now I've found you," she said softly. Elijah didn't know what to make of it. Was it fate? Coincidence? Or was something greater at work here on his lonely stretch of land? For the first time in years, he found himself asking questions he had buried deep, afraid of the answers. Word got around. A few ranch hands riding nearby noticed smoke rising again from Elijah Booker's chimney. They whispered about the nun staying with him. Some thought she was a ghost. Others believed she was a sign of redemption. A few even dared to ride up the hill and knock, but Elijah didn't answer the door. Not yet. The outside world still felt like a threat. But inside the house, something was changing. The walls felt less heavy, the rooms less cold. And in the morning light, the dust in the air didn't look like ash, it looked like golden mist. One night, while they sat watching the fire, Sister Agnes said something that made Elijah's breath catch. "You're not meant to die alone on this land," she whispered. "You were made to protect it, and the people who will come after you." He looked at her, eyes narrowing. "Ain't nobody coming after me," he replied. But even as he said it, the ember of doubt flickered. Could it be true? Could this be the beginning of something new? Elijah didn't know. But he stayed quiet as she reached for the old guitar in the corner, his wife's guitar, and began to play the softest tune he'd heard in years. The nun's presence altered the rhythm of the ranch. Mornings that were once greeted with silence now came with the soft rustle of her footsteps and whispered prayers carried by the breeze. The black rancher, though still guarded, found her company oddly comforting. She spoke very little of herself, but her eyes carried entire stories, some joyous, some shadowed by pain. On the third morning, as they shared black coffee on the porch, she asked about the land, his cattle, and how he kept the ranch alive all those years. He spoke slowly, with the weight of a man who'd forgotten how to share words. But he spoke. And for the first time in over a decade, his words didn't echo back unanswered. One evening, the nun offered to cook. It had been years since anyone besides the rancher had lit the stove. The air filled with a warmth that was more than just heat, it was memory, something lost returning in smells and sounds. As they ate, she recited a prayer in Spanish, something from her childhood, and he listened without interrupting. Afterward, they sat in silence, the kind that didn't need to be broken. That night, he didn't drink himself to sleep. Instead, he sat under the stars a little longer than usual, staring at the same heavens he'd once cursed, now wondering if this was all meant to happen. Days turned into a week. The nun never asked for more than he gave. But one morning, she stood in the barn, staring at an old photograph pinned to a wooden beam. It was faded but clear, a young man in a soldier's uniform, standing beside a white woman holding a newborn. "Your family?" she asked gently. He nodded. "They're gone," he added. She didn't pry. She simply said, "You've carried them with you in this silence." The rancher turned away quickly, but her words hung in the air like gospel. That night, he took the photo down and placed it on the table where they had dinner. "So they can eat with us," he said. There was a softness forming between them, not romantic, not exactly. It was the kind of bond forged between souls who recognized each other's solitude. She mended his old shirts with hands that trembled slightly. He repaired the chapel behind the barn, a place he hadn't stepped into since the cross fell from the wall 10 years ago. They never spoke of the past again, not directly. But each act, each fence post replaced, each hymn hummed softly in the kitchen, became a line in the story they were rewriting together. And in that rewriting, something inside him began to wake. Then came the storm. Texas storms don't knock. They crash. Thunder roared across the plains like a stampede of ancient horses. The power went out, and the wind screamed through the cracks in the walls. She sat in the dark with a candle, calmly reciting scripture, while he checked the stables. As lightning split the sky, he saw a figure near the fence. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks, but the figure didn't vanish. He grabbed his rifle, the one untouched for years, and stepped out into the chaos. What he found waiting would shatter everything he thought he understood about his isolation. A boy, maybe 11 or 12, stood soaked and shivering, clothes torn and eyes wide with fear. The rancher lowered the gun slowly, confusion and instinct warring inside him. Behind the boy, nothing but rain and darkness. He brought him inside. The nun rushed to help, wrapping him in wool and whispering prayers. When the boy finally spoke, it was one word: "Run." But before they could ask anything more, the sound of hooves tore through the storm. Riders. Unseen in the darkness. Fast, violent. The rancher looked at the nun. She stood, candle still in hand. "We have to hide him," she said without blinking. They hid the boy in the cellar, beneath the loose floorboard that once stored the rancher's old war medals. The sound of horses grew closer. The rancher lit a lantern, calmly opened the front door, and stepped into the storm. For men, faces obscured by rain-drenched hats, sat atop soaked mustangs. They asked about a boy. Said he was a thief. Said he took something holy. The rancher didn't flinch. "Ain't seen no one but her," he said, nodding toward the nun. The men's eyes narrowed. One dismounted. The tension sliced the air like lightning. The nun stepped forward. "We're just travelers," she said. The man glared, but said nothing. They left, but not without a promise to return. That night, no one slept. The rancher kept the rifle beside his chair. The nun held a rosary that shook in her hands. The boy finally spoke again. He said they weren't bounty hunters. They were part of something darker, a cult, old and hidden, that believed the boy was a vessel. He didn't understand it, but he knew they'd never stop. The rancher stared into the fireplace, its glow casting shadows on his face. "Then we protect him," he said. "Not as a plan. As a fact." The ranch transformed overnight. Windows reinforced, supplies gathered, escape routes mapped. The nun worked beside him, her frailty overcome by determination. The boy watched them both, two people who owed him nothing, preparing to stand against something they barely understood. The rancher trained him how to shoot, how to hide, how to survive. The nun taught him to pray, not for rescue, but for courage. The boy began to smile again. Just once. But it was enough. Enough to remind them all what was at stake. When the riders returned, they didn't come at night. They came at dawn, with fire and gunpowder. But they didn't expect a man who had once faced war to be ready, nor a nun who would stand on the porch, eyes steady, holding a cross like a sword. The battle wasn't long, but it was brutal. In the end, silence returned to the ranch, but not the same silence that haunted it before. This was the silence of peace, of wounds healing. And beneath the floorboards, the boy emerged, not as a victim, but as family. When the morning sun crept over the plains, casting golden light through the lace-curtained windows, Elijah sat quietly at the table with his Bible open but unread. The events of the night clung to him like the morning dew on the pasture grass. He thought Sister Agnes might be gone, vanished like a spirit who had come to stir his soul and disappear. But there she was, sitting on the front porch with a cup of his strong coffee in her hands, humming a hymn he hadn't heard in decades. Something shifted in Elijah's heart. It wasn't love, not the romantic kind, but a recognition, an understanding. She had awakened a part of him buried under 15 years of grief and isolation. He stepped outside, pulled up a second chair, and sat beside her without a word. The wind whispered through the dry grass, and they sat in peace. He didn't ask her why she stayed. He didn't need to. The silence between them was enough. That day passed slowly, with a rhythm Elijah had almost forgotten. Sister Agnes helped feed the animals and insisted on sweeping the front steps, despite the wind blowing the dust back up as soon as she finished. She laughed at the futility of it, and for the first time in 15 years, Elijah laughed too. It felt like something old and dusty cracking open inside him. As the sun lowered in the sky, they shared a pot of beans and cornbread. She told him stories of the places she'd seen, the missions she had served, and the people who had changed her life. Elijah listened, fascinated. It wasn't just the words, it was the life she carried in her voice. That night, as he walked her to the spare room again, she turned and placed her hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to keep punishing yourself," she said gently. He didn't respond, but the words burned into him deeper than he expected. Days turned into a week. Sister Agnes stayed. At first, Elijah told himself it was temporary, that she was just passing through. But she unpacked her small bag. She set out her books, wrote letters in careful cursive, and began planting herbs in a patch of dry soil near the back door. The house began to smell different, not of loneliness and dust, but of cinnamon and rosemary and life. Elijah noticed himself walking straighter, humming again while chopping firewood. When he found himself whistling a gospel tune he hadn't heard in 20 years, he stopped, stunned. Sister Agnes never pried into his past, but her presence was like a mirror, quietly reflecting all he'd let go of. One evening, he told her about Martha, about the child, about how he blamed himself. She didn't offer platitudes. She only listened, eyes full of silent grace. And that was enough to begin the healing. Word spread slowly through the nearby town that Elijah wasn't alone anymore. At first, folks just gossiped. But then came the real surprise. Visitors. A local boy came by asking if Elijah needed help mending a fence. An old friend from church drove out one afternoon, pretending he'd just been in the area. Someone even brought a pie. Elijah didn't know what to do with all this attention. Sister Agnes accepted each visitor with the same warm smile and calm conversation. Slowly, Elijah found himself welcoming them too. It was awkward at first. He was rusty with words, unsure of smiles. But it came back, like rain after drought. One Sunday, he stepped inside the old chapel in town for the first time since Martha's funeral. The people stared. Then they smiled. The preacher stopped mid-sermon and said, "Welcome home, Brother Elijah." He nodded, tears in his eyes. The stone in his chest had begun to crack. A few months later, Elijah did something he hadn't imagined in years. He hosted a community dinner on his ranch. Long tables were set up in the pasture, lanterns strung between posts, and music filled the air. Sister Agnes made stew that people talked about for weeks after. Children ran between the fences, laughter echoing through the fields. Elijah stood with a cup of cider in hand, watching it all with wonder. It felt like resurrection. People came to him, not out of pity, but because they saw the change. Because they remembered the man he used to be and saw that he had returned. That night, after the last guest had left and the lanterns were dimmed, he sat beside Sister Agnes once more. "Thank you," he whispered. She only smiled. "You saved yourself," she replied. And he believed her. With time, Sister Agnes moved on. She was a traveler by calling, after all. But she left more than memories. She left a garden blooming with herbs and flowers. She left her worn Bible on the windowsill, marked with notes and prayers in the margins. She left Elijah changed, not just repaired, but renewed. When she left, he didn't cry. He saddled his horse and rode beside her to the crossroads. They hugged goodbye like family. "Keep the door open," she said. And he did. He kept the door open for anyone who needed a place to rest, a meal to eat, or just a story to tell. He became the old man who always had hot coffee and a seat on the porch. And people came. Because even in the quiet wild of the prairie, stories travel. Years later, a new generation knew the story of the black rancher who once lived alone for 15 years, until a nun knocked on his door. Some said it was fate. Others called it divine intervention. Elijah just called it grace. His ranch became more than a home. It became a place of peace, of community, of second chances. Children played where once silence ruled. Songs were sung where once only the wind spoke. Elijah aged, but never again was he lonely. He lived with the knowledge that one night, a quiet knock changed everything. That one heart, full of compassion, had opened his. And that made all the difference. As Elijah's hair turned fully silver, he wrote letters of his own. Letters to friends, to former strangers who'd become family, to Sister Agnes wherever she was. He told them about the life he'd found again, about the things that truly mattered, connection, forgiveness, courage to let go of guilt. He wrote about how grief never truly leaves, but how it can become a garden if tended with care. His porch became a place of story swapping. Travelers came not just to rest, but to learn from him. And he welcomed each one, eyes bright, voice steady, heart wide open. They didn't see a broken man. They saw a legend. Not because he was extraordinary, but because he allowed himself to be transformed. Elijah passed quietly one spring morning, with the sun rising just as it had the day Sister Agnes arrived. In his room was the Bible she left, open to a passage about hospitality and angels unaware. His funeral drew people from counties away. They shared stories of how he had changed their lives with nothing more than a smile, a plate of food, and a listening ear. No statue was raised, no book written, but his legacy was etched in hearts. The ranch, now cared for by others, remained open to wanderers, to the broken, to the weary. And on the porch, in a rocking chair that never stopped moving, many swore they could feel Elijah's spirit still watching the prairie, smiling in the wind. So if you ever find yourself lost out there, on a dusty road, carrying more sorrow than you know what to do with, remember this story. Remember that a knock on the door can change everything. That grace can take the shape of a nun's gentle voice. That healing begins with a simple yes to something new. And most of all, remember Elijah, a black rancher who waited 15 years in silence, until a single night gave him his voice back. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, leave your thoughts in the comments, and give us a like to keep more stories like this alive. Your support brings these forgotten tales back to the world.